Thanks for joining me, Peter.
My pleasure.
We'll be talking about Jordan today. So just to recap, it's been over a week since ISIL released a video of Jordanian pilot Lieutenant Moaz al-Qasasbeh being burned alive. Jordan's King Abdullah II cut his trip short to the US and ordered the execution of 2 convicts. He's quoted as saying, "The blood of the martyr Moaz al-Qasasbeh will not be in vain, and the response of Jordan and its army after what happened to our dear son will be severe." 2 days after, Jordanian fighter jets joined coalition airstrikes against ISIS targets, carrying out nearly 20% of all sorties. So, did ISIL overreach in killing the Jordanian pilot? Was it a miscalculation? Or was Jordan playing into ISIL's hands by retaliating with prisoner executions and heavy-handed responses?
Well, I think ISIL has thought through this act very carefully. At one level, it is clearly an immensely inhumane and bloodthirsty act. But that doesn't mean to say that careful thinking hasn't gone on behind what they've done. And so, for example, in the video is accompanied by some on-screen text, which is the effect of which is to point back to an early Quranic saying about the cleansing nature of holy fire. This is something which actually, again, is designed to appeal to a community of potential recruits, primarily from Sunni Muslims. And we know from what we've seen in social media after the killing that, in fact, a significant number of people reacted in that way. So the first point is, yes, ISIL has, as per usual, thought through this in terms of its own bloodthirsty strategy. I think something that was perhaps a little unexpected was the strength of the Jordanian reaction was as strong as it was. And I think that the airstrikes which the Jordanians have undertaken was probably not what ISIL was hoping for. I think they were hoping to actually essentially push them out of the coalition.
And that hasn't happened, obviously.
That has not happened, although I think we've yet to see how this is going to play out as a long-term thing in terms of Jordanian politics. There's no question that there is a group, a Sunni community within Jordan who are still quite sympathetic to ISIL, and I think that in some respects what we see here is a regime which is significantly under pressure and looking for ways to try to get its community back on side.
Actually, speaking of domestic challenges, there were very fierce protests. People were outraged at the death of this pilot they see as their son following the release of that video. Is there any sense of longevity to this anti-ISIL sentiment for now?
I think it will sustain for a period. What remains to be seen, though, is how effective the regime's response can be. In undertaking those airstrikes in Syria, they're going after known ISIL targets. There's still every attempt on the part of the air campaign to not hit civilian areas, civilian houses and things of that nature. And we've seen, more generally across the coalition's attacks over the last few months that there are fewer and fewer of these targets that they can hit. And frankly, it's not yet making a strategic difference. It may be having some tactical effect, but it's not really having an impact on the leadership of ISIL or the fact that they're controlling a lot of territory still, both in Syria and in Iraq.
And speaking of those airstrikes, the head of Jordan's Air Force came out on the weekend and said that Jordan had degraded about 20%, or airstrikes rather, had degraded 20% of ISIL's capabilities. They have been also involved in 56 airstrikes since they decided to join their aircraft. What are the risks to civilian casualties, and what are the further risks of Jordan's participation in this airstrikes campaign?
Well, the civilian casualties have been minimised because the air campaign so far has been directed at what are only obviously ISIL targets, for example, troops that are moving, vehicles that are moving, or buildings which have been identified as part of ISIL's campaign headquarters in Raqqa. I think we need to be a little sceptical that the casualty rates which have been claimed, some 7,000 ISIL people are now said to have been killed in airstrikes. I just don't actually see the evidence to demonstrate that that's the case. And the Jordanians also said, in fact, that they would not be bombing population centres, they wouldn't be bombing civilian houses. which is a guarantee that ISIL can possibly have that if they continue to hide their leadership in the civilian populations of Raqqa and Mosul, that they're largely going to be secure. So I'm sticking to the view that what we have mostly is a stalemate, even though some gains have been made on the ground by coalition forces.
Speaking of fighters, has the rate of foreign fighters joining the fight in Iraq and Syria increasing or is it decreasing, and why?
I think it's been increasing over the last 6 months. So what we know from CIA figures was that at the time ISIL crossed the border from Syria into Iraq and took over Mosul and large parts of the Sunni centre of the country, in June of 2014 there were said to be about 6,000 ISIL fighters. And as recently as I think maybe 10 days ago, the Australian Minister for Defence said that the current estimate was 31,500 ISIL fighters. So in other words, they've been joining at the rate of about 5,000 a month. And I think what that's pointing to is the success of ISIL's propaganda. We are talking mostly about Syrians, but in addition, or as a part of that 31,500, perhaps 4,000 or 5,000 people from outside of Syria, and that includes the Australians and the British and others which have gone to join.
Let's just turn to the ground campaign for a second. I mean, will airstrikes be enough? Will there need to be a further ground campaign? And if that's the case, is there any sense of a timeline for these operations?
Airstrikes won't be enough. At the end of the day, I think we're stuck in an old military truism, which is that you need ground forces to take and hold ground in order to control the battlefield. And because airstrikes have been very, very contained and limited around hitting identifiable ISIL targets, the population centres that they control still remain very thoroughly in ISIL hands. So in the case of Mosul, that's a city of 1.5 million people. It's the second biggest city in Iraq. There have been no strikes in Mosul, primarily out of an Allied concern to avoid civilian targets. And the only way I can see that city coming back into Iraqi control will be through a ground operation. So then the question is, well, how long will it take to train either the Iraqi army or Iraqi militia to undertake these ground campaigns to retake land? We've seen some militia activity in Anbar province, but that's created some difficulties in its own right because it's been Iranian-backed Iraqi Shia undertaking military actions into Sunni territory in the centre of Iraq. And basically that is only going to help cement the split between the Shia and the Sunni in Iraq. As far as Syria is concerned, there's really no solution. Victory over ISIL only means more strength to President Assad and his murderous forces. And until we have, a more coherent Western plan to do something of a big nature about the vacuum that is existing in Syria, I really don't see a solution to what's going to happen on the ground.
I see. And one final question on coalition operations. It wasn't just Jordan that was impacted by this video. The United Arab Emirates also announced that it would leave coalition air operations. Why did that happen, and what do you think the impact of that will be?
Well, I think the UAE had two concerns. They had a military concern and they had a strategic concern. And I thought the media coverage in the West of their decision to suspend operations was actually not very intelligent. It almost implied a sort of lack of moral fibre that they would not fly these operations over ISIL territory. But there was more to it than that. Firstly, I think it's a mark of a good defence force that it wants to be able to rescue its airmen and women if they're crash in enemy territory. And it seems to me that the US and coalition forces really had no strategy for how to rescue people that had crashed in Syria in particular. So, when that unfortunate Jordanian crashed, it was impossible to see how an operation could be mounted to really even attempt to rescue the guy. And I think the UAE was doing the right thing by its pilots to say, well, we need to have more of an effective response option to pick them up. The strategic issue was very different, and that related to a UAE concern not to be using their air power to defend the progression of Iranian dominance in Iraq, because we have in the UAE, the Emiratis are primarily Sunnis, and they were aghast at the thought that their air power might actually be helping Iranian Shia power extend further into Iraq, north of Baghdad. And I think that by doing this, they were really saying to the Americans, you guys need to understand some of the subtleties of what's going on here. You know, it's not that the Iranians are particularly our friends in this campaign. Since then, what the UAE has done is it's moved a squadron of aircraft into Jordan, which I think is all about looking to see if it can have a more immediate and direct air campaign over Syria, because obviously the geography means that those aircraft are now closer to their targets in Syria, and I think they're getting back into air operations. So, you know, my view was the UAE had some sensible concerns, and it looks as though they've also taken some steps to try to improve the position of their forces, at least as far as the campaign in Syria is concerned.
Well, thank you for joining us, and hopefully we'll talk again as more developments unfold.
Thank you, Nat. My pleasure.